The smell hit me before anything else did. Diane's perfume, the same powder rose scent she had worn my entire life, hanging in the air of that front hallway like a warning I almost missed. I shifted the ceramic dish in my arms and stopped walking. Something was off. It was Thanksgiving morning and the house was too quiet. No football from the back room. No Camille laughing too loud at something that wasn't funny. Just that perfume and that silence sitting together like they were waiting for me. I walked around the corner into the living room. Marcus was on the couch. He was sitting there with his coat still on and a bottle of wine on the cushion beside him, smiling the way he always smiled when he thought he had already won something. He looked up at me like this was completely normal. Like 8 months of divorce paperwork and silence and rebuilding my entire life from scratch had never happened at all. My mother looked up from across the room and said it without blinking. I thought it was time we all acted like adults. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I just stood there holding my grandmother's serving dish and understood in that 1 second that this was not a mistake. This was planned. And whatever was about to happen inside that house, I could not let a single person in that room see me fall apart. My name is Nora Calloway. I am 34 years old and I work as an accountant at a mid-size financial firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I am not the daughter people write speeches about. I am the one who shows up early, helps in the kitchen, remembers what everyone is allergic to, and drives home alone without complaining. That has always been my role in this family, and I accepted it for a long time because I genuinely believed that being useful was the same thing as being loved. My mother, Diane, never made it easy to believe otherwise. She is warm and generous and funny in the way that certain women are, the kind that charms every room she enters, and she has spent most of my life directing that warmth almost entirely at my younger sister, Camille. Not in a hidden way. Not even in a way she would deny if you asked her directly. Just openly, consistently, the way some families have a favorite chair that everyone quietly agrees belongs to one person. Marcus came into my life 6 years ago and walked straight into Diane's good graces inside of one dinner. She called me the next morning and said he was exactly what I needed. When the marriage ended 8 months ago, she cried harder than I did, and somehow that became my fault too. I had spent those 8 months doing the quiet work of getting my life back. New apartment on the east side, 1 bedroom, good light in the mornings. A promotion I earned without asking anyone for anything. Therapy every Tuesday at 6, which I used to think was a weakness and now understand is just maintenance. I had not been back to this house since July. Came back because Diane called 3 times and guilt is a language I was raised to be fluent in. Before I left my apartment that morning, I stood in my kitchen looking at my grandmother's old serving dish sitting on the counter, cream-colored ceramic with a small chip on the rim from years of use. Diane always said that dish would go to the daughter who kept the family together. I never knew exactly what she meant by that. I was about to find out. I set the serving dish on the counter and got to work. That was always how it went. I arrived early, tied on an apron, and made myself useful before anyone asked me to. Kitchen was exactly the way it had always been. Same white cabinets with the sticky drawer on the left that never closed right. Same window above the sink that looked out onto the backyard where the old oak tree had dropped half its leaves onto the patio furniture nobody had covered yet. Same arrangement of spice jars on the counter that Diane rearranged every few months and that I could still navigate with my eyes closed. I started on the vegetables. Diane moved around me the way she always did in her own kitchen, comfortable and unhurried, giving instructions she didn't need to give because I already knew what came next. We worked in the easy silence of 2 people who have shared this exact routine enough times that words are mostly optional. Felt normal. That was the thing. Felt like every other Thanksgiving I had shown up for with my sleeves rolled up and nowhere more important to be. Camille arrived at 11:30. She walked in wearing a camel-colored coat I had never seen before and boots that were not made for anyone planning to spend time on their feet in a kitchen. Her hair was done. Her makeup was done. She looked like she had come from somewhere and was planning to be photographed. Diane turned from the stove and her whole face changed the way it always changed when Camille walked into a room, like a lamp switching on. "There she is," Diane said. They hugged for a long time. I kept chopping. Camille set her bag down on the chair by the window and pulled out her phone almost immediately. She checked it, put it face down on the table, then picked it up again 2 minutes later. Whatever she saw made the corner of her mouth lift just slightly before she smoothed her expression back to neutral. She didn't say anything about it, and I didn't ask. I was setting out the good plates when Diane mentioned Marcus. She said it the way you mention the weather. Casual, no weight behind it, just information passing through the room. She said he had called that morning to wish her happy holidays and that it was very thoughtful of him. I placed a fork on the folded napkin and did not look up. I said that was nice. Diane moved on to checking the oven and I moved on to the next place setting, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't, and somewhere under my sternum I already knew that. Camille checked her phone a third time. The same small private smile. She set it face down again before I could read anything on the screen. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. I wiped my hands on the dish towel and walked toward the front door, assuming it was my aunt or one of Diane's neighbors who always stopped by with something wrapped in foil. I reached for the handle and pulled it open. Marcus was standing on the front porch holding a bottle of red wine and wearing the dark gray jacket he knew he looked good in. He smiled the moment he saw me. Not a guilty smile. Not an awkward one. The easy, settled smile of a man who had already decided how this moment was going to go and was simply waiting for me to catch up to his version of it. "Nora," he said. Like we were old friends running into each other at a grocery store. I did not slam the door. I did not say the things that were suddenly lined up behind my teeth. I had spent enough years in enough rooms performing composure that my body knew how to do it even when my mind was still catching up. I stepped to the side and let him in. He walked past me into the hallway, said something about the house smelling great, and headed toward the living room like he had never stopped coming here. I stood at the open door for 3 more seconds looking at the empty porch. Then I closed it and went to find my mother. Diane was at the stove when I came back into the kitchen. I waited until Camille had drifted toward the living room before I moved to stand beside her. I kept my voice low and completely level because I knew that if I let any heat into it, she would make the conversation about my tone and we would never get to the truth. I asked her why Marcus was here. She didn't flinch. She stirred the pot in front of her and said she had invited him because the holidays were hard on people and he was practically family and it had seemed like the right thing to do. I asked her when she had last spoken to him. That was when she told me. Came out in pieces, the way admissions do when someone has been holding something and decides all at once to put it down. She had not just called him once. She had been meeting him for lunch. 4 times since the summer, maybe 5. She had told him about my new apartment, about the promotion, about the fact that I was seeing a therapist. She said she was just keeping him in the loop because she hated the idea of him feeling cut off from the family. I stood very still. I picked up the wooden spoon on the counter and began stirring the gravy because I needed something to do with my hands while I processed what she had just said. She had been reporting my life back to my ex-husband for 8 months. Not out of cruelty, or so she would tell herself. Out of that particular kind of loyalty she had always saved for the wrong people. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I finished the gravy and made a decision. I was going to stay. I was going to sit at that table and eat that food and speak when spoken to and smile when smiling was required. And I was going to watch every single person in that house very, very carefully. Not yet. But I was done being the only one in the room without a plan. The hour before dinner was when the house filled up properly. Diane's sister arrived with her husband and their teenage son, who immediately disappeared upstairs. A neighbor came by with a pie and stayed longer than she probably intended to. Someone put on music at a low volume and people arranged themselves into the loose, comfortable clusters that happen at family gatherings when everyone has had one drink and the food is almost ready. I moved through the room with a glass of sparkling water and made myself easy to overlook. That has always been one of my more useful skills. I ask a question and let someone else answer it for 5 minutes. I refill things. I laugh at the right moments. People stop tracking you when you make yourself part of the furniture, and I needed to be part of the furniture right now. Marcus had settled into the living room like he owned the square footage. He was talking to Diane's brother-in-law about something that was making them both laugh. Camille was nearby, still on her phone, but differently now. Less casual. She was typing with focus, the way you type when the conversation matters. I drifted toward the hallway. I did not follow them. I didn't need to. The hallway in that house runs alongside the kitchen, and if you stand near the far end of the counter with the overhead fan running, you can hear a conversation from the hall without being visible from either direction. I had discovered this when I was 12 years old, and it had never stopped being useful. Their voices were low, but not low enough. Caught the shape of it before I caught the specific words. Tone was what hit me first. It was not the tone of two people catching up. It was the tone of two people who had already agreed on something and were checking in on the progress of it. Then I heard the name. David Holt. My supervisor at the firm. The man who had copied the email about my promotion review 3 weeks ago. Marcus said something about a reference. Then something about a conversation that had already happened. Then the word is handled, quiet and final, the way you say a word when it means more than it sounds like. Camille said something back that I couldn't fully catch, and then they moved and I stopped leaning. I walked to the bathroom, closed the door, and opened my phone. I texted Priya, who has worked in a contractor role connected to our firm's HR department for the past 2 years and who I trusted more than anyone else in that building. I kept it short. I asked if anyone at the office had mentioned Marcus recently. I ran cold water over my wrists while I waited. Her reply came back in 4 minutes. She said she needed to call me. She said it couldn't wait and that I should find somewhere private. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I called her back with the fan running and the door locked, and in the next 90 seconds she told me that Marcus had contacted human resources at my firm 6 weeks ago. He had not called to threaten anyone or make demands. He had been calm, she said. Concerned even. He had introduced himself as my former spouse and told them he was reaching out privately because he was worried about my emotional stability following the divorce. He had used the word episodes. He had mentioned that I had been struggling and that he felt someone at my workplace should be aware. I sat down on the edge of the bathtub. Diane had told him about my therapy. She had told him about the hard months after the divorce when I had not been sleeping well and had missed one Sunday dinner and cried on the phone with her once in September. She had handed him the details, and he had taken them to my employer and shaped them into something that sounded like a warning. Promotion I had earned. The stability I had rebuilt from nothing. The professional life I had protected through every hard month of the past year. He had been walking through it quietly, touching things, leaving damage I hadn't even known to look for yet. This was never just about one dinner. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back into the noise of the house like nothing had shifted. I stopped in the kitchen long enough to check on the rolls in the oven and tell Diane they needed 5 more minutes. She thanked me. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door and told the room in general that I had forgotten something in my car. Nobody looked up. That was the thing about being the reliable one. People trusted your movements without questioning them because you had never given them a reason not to. Outside the air was cold and sharp and exactly what I needed. I walked to my car, got in, closed the door, and called Priya. She picked up on the first ring. She did not panic. That was the first thing I noticed, and it steadied me more than anything else could have in that moment. Priya processes things the way good accountants do, which is to say she separates the emotion from the information and deals with the information first. She told me she had been uncomfortable about the HR inquiry since the day it came through. Something about the framing had felt off to her. Too careful. Too specifically worded to sound like concern while functioning like a complaint. She had flagged it internally to herself and saved the email thread before it moved up the chain. She had saved it. I closed my eyes for 1 second. She told me there was something else. Camille's name was in one of the forwarded messages. Not mentioned in passing. Cited directly as a source. Marcus had included her in the email chain at one point, and she had replied with 3 things. My work schedule for the month of October, the full name of my supervisor David Holt, and a written account of an incident at a family event where she claimed I had become emotionally overwhelmed and had to be asked to leave the room. That incident did not happen. There was no such event. There was no such moment. It was a fabrication built from nothing and submitted to my employer as though it were fact. I sat in my cold car on Thanksgiving morning and let that land fully before I responded. Priya didn't rush me. She waited. Then I asked her if she could compile everything and send it to my personal email before the end of the night. She said she already had it ready and would send it within the hour. I thanked her, and she said the kind of thing that people only say when they mean it. She said she was sorry this was happening and that she was going to make sure I had everything I needed to protect myself. Then she hung up because Priya is not a person who wastes words. I sat there for another minute looking at the front of my mother's house through the windshield. Then I went back inside. I took off my coat. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink. And I picked up my grandmother's serving dish from the counter where I had left it that morning and carried it to the center of the dining room table. I set it down carefully and stepped back and looked at it sitting there in the middle of everything Diane had arranged to humiliate me. I was not surviving this dinner anymore. I was collecting it. Dinner looked exactly the way Diane always made it look. Table was full and the candles were lit and everyone had a full glass and something warm in front of them. Marcus sat 2 seats down from me on the same side of the table so I could not see his face without turning my head. Camille sat across from him. Diane sat at the head of the table the way she always did, the way that said without words that everything here existed because of her. I ate. I answered questions when they came my way. Passed things when asked. I was present enough to be invisible, and that was exactly where I needed to be. My phone buzzed against my thigh at 7:14. I waited 4 minutes before I excused myself. I said I needed the bathroom, and I said it the same way I had said everything else that evening, lightly, without weight, the way you speak when you need a room full of people to keep moving without you. I locked the door and opened Priya's email. She had sent 5 attachments. I opened them in order. First was the original HR inquiry from Marcus. Reading it in full was different from hearing Priya describe it. Seeing his name at the top and his words in a formal email chain made something in my chest go very still. He had written it like a man who cared. Every sentence was measured and soft and constructed to sound like worry. It was one of the most calculated things I had ever read. The second attachment was the forwarded message containing Camille's response. Her schedule notes were precise. She had written my supervisor's name correctly, spelled it right, which told me she had looked it up rather than going from memory. The fabricated account of my supposed breakdown was 4 sentences long and written with the kind of specific detail that makes a lie easier to believe. The third email was still loading. Before I tell you what I found in that third email, I need to stop for just 1 second. Drop a comment right now and tell me honestly. Did you see this coming, or did this completely blindside you? 'Cause I have talked to people about this story and the answers are always split right down the middle. The third email was loaded. It was from Marcus to Camille, dated 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. The subject line was blank. The message was 4 lines long. He wrote that once I was out of my current position, the account review would go their way. He wrote that the timing needed to stay clean. And then he wrote the line that I read 3 times before I fully accepted that it was real. He wrote that Diane would back them if it came to that. That she always did. Diane knew. Not the full shape of it, maybe. Not every detail. But she had known enough to be included in that sentence as a certainty. She had known enough that Marcus had written her name into his plan without hesitation, the way you write down something you have already confirmed. I turned off my phone screen and stood in that small bathroom for 10 seconds. Then I put my phone in my pocket, unlocked the door, walked back down the hallway, and sat down at my mother's table. I picked up my fork. Nobody had noticed I was gone. I spent the rest of that dinner being the warmest version of myself I had ever performed. Not fake exactly. More precise. I chose every word the way you choose where to step when the ground is uncertain. I laughed at the right moments. I asked questions that sounded like genuine interest, and I listened to the answers the way you listen when you are actually filing things away rather than just being polite. I turned to Marcus somewhere between the main course and the last of the bread. I asked him how work was going. I kept my voice easy and my expression open, and I gave him nothing to be suspicious of. He answered without hesitating because Marcus has always liked talking about himself most when he believes he has an appreciative audience. He mentioned a new client. He mentioned a contract that was in review. He mentioned a timeline that meant something to me now in a way it would not have meant 2 hours earlier. I nodded and asked one follow-up question, and he gave me 2 more details without realizing he had done it. I turned to Camille a few minutes later. I asked about her boyfriend's company. Specifically, I asked how things were going for him with his current clients, whether business had been steady. Kept it conversational, the kind of question a sister asks at a holiday table. Camille's eyes moved just slightly before she answered. She said things were fine and changed the subject inside of one breath. Smooth but fast. Too fast. The deflection itself told me everything I needed it to tell me. She knew that I knew that her boyfriend's company was connected to the account at my firm. She just didn't know how much I knew or when I had found it out. I let it go and passed the butter to Diane's sister. I excused myself one final time before dessert was served. Back in the bathroom, I moved quickly. I forwarded all 5 of Priya's attachments from my personal email to the address of my attorney, a woman named Carol Vass who had handled my divorce proceedings and who had told me at our last meeting to contact her directly if anything new came up involving Marcus. I also sent her 2 voice memos I had recorded quietly at the table during dinner. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I had looked that up in July when I first started feeling like I needed to know it. Carol's reply came while I was washing my hands. She wrote 7 words. Don't confront tonight. Come Monday. This is actionable. I dried my hands and walked back out. Dessert was on the table by the time I sat down. Diane had made the pie she always made, the one Camille always complimented loudly and that I had eaten quietly for 20 years. Marcus tapped his glass and stood up and made a toast. He talked about family and gratitude and the importance of the people who stay in your life. Diane beamed at him like he was something she had grown herself. Camille raised her glass with that same private smile I had been watching all evening. I raised mine too. My grandmother's serving dish sat in the center of the table, empty and waiting, the food long gone from it. It had done exactly what it came here to do. I was in Carol's office by 9 o'clock Monday morning. She had read everything over the weekend, and by the time I sat down across from her desk, she already had a yellow legal pad covered in notes. She walked me through it the way good attorneys do, without drama, just structure. She explained what we had, what it meant, and what the likely path forward looked like. The email chain was clean and unbroken. The HR inquiry was documented. Priya's testimony was credible and came with saved records. The voice memos added texture, but the emails alone were enough to move on. Carol filed the formal complaint with the firm's ethics office by Wednesday. What came out of the internal review over the following days was the detail that changed the shape of everything. Camille had a vendor-adjacent relationship with my firm through her boyfriend's company. That relationship required her to sign a non-disclosure agreement when it was established, a standard document that prohibited her from sharing internal personnel information with outside parties. She had signed it 14 months ago and apparently decided it did not apply to her when it became inconvenient. She had never disclosed that relationship to anyone in our family. Not to me. Not even, it turned out, to Diane. Priya testified internally on the Thursday before the conference room meeting. She was calm and specific and did not exaggerate a single thing, which made her impossible to dismiss. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, I sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of my firm with Carol on my left and a printed copy of the full email chain in front of me. Marcus came in with his own attorney. He wore the gray jacket again. I noticed that, and then I let it go because it no longer meant anything to me. The ethics officer read the 3rd email aloud. The one with the 4 lines. The one with Diane's name in it. Marcus looked at the table. He did not deny it. He did not offer an explanation or a reframe or one of the smooth, reasonable-sounding responses he had always been so good at producing. He just looked at the table and stayed quiet, and in that silence every carefully constructed version of himself that he had ever presented to anyone in my life came apart completely. The firm terminated Camille's vendor relationship by end of business that same day. Marcus's attorney received formal notice of civil liability proceedings before the week was out. I was home by 6. My phone rang at 7:30. It was Diane. Her voice was different. The thing she usually wore in her voice, that particular layer of control and performance that I had been listening to my entire life, was gone. She sounded smaller than I had ever heard her sound. She said she didn't know it had gone that far. I said she knew enough. Then I stopped talking and I waited. The silence that followed was the longest she had ever given me. She didn't answer. She stayed on the line, but she did not answer, and that silence told me everything that an explanation never would have. She had known enough to be written into that email as a certainty. She had known enough to keep having lunch with my ex-husband for 8 months while I rebuilt my life and told her things I thought were private. She had known enough. The silence was the verdict, and we both understood it. 3 months later, my supervisor called me into his office and offered me the promotion. I accepted it the same way I had done everything else over the past year. Quietly, without making a production of it, with a thank you that was genuine and a walk back to my desk that I took at a completely normal pace. I sat down in my chair and opened my laptop and got back to work. I did not call anyone. I did not post anything. I just let it be real for a few minutes before I moved on to the next thing. That evening I drove home and stood in my kitchen and looked at my grandmother's serving dish sitting on the counter where I had put it the morning after Thanksgiving and never moved it. The small chip on the rim caught the light the same way it always had. I made dinner and ate at my own table in my own apartment, and the quiet felt like something I had earned rather than something I was stuck with. Diane and I speak occasionally now. Not warmly, the way we used to perform warmth at each other across holiday tables. But honestly, which is something we never quite managed before. She asks how I am, and I tell her the truth, and she listens in a way she did not used to listen. I do not know if that will ever become something more than what it currently is. I have stopped needing it too. Camille sent me a message in January. It was long. Covered a lot of ground. There was an explanation for every decision and a reason behind every reason, and somewhere near the middle of it she used the word misunderstood in a way that was clearly meant to apply to herself. I read it twice all the way through because I believed she deserved that much. Then I put my phone down and I did not reply. Not out of anger. I had moved through the anger already and came out the other side into something cooler and cleaner. I simply had nothing to say that would have mattered to either one of us. Marcus's civil case settled 3 months after the conference room meeting. Terms were private. I know what I need to know, and the rest of it is no longer my concern. Priya and I have lunch every other week now. Real lunch, the kind where you talk about things that have nothing to do with work or legal proceedings or other people's bad decisions. She is funny in a dry, understated way that I had not fully noticed when we were only colleagues. I notice it now. I think about that Thanksgiving dinner sometimes. Not with bitterness, more with a kind of clarity. Diane had planned that evening to put me back in a place I had spent 8 months climbing out of. She wanted Marcus at that table and me across from him so I would feel small and replaceable and reminded of everything I had walked away from. Instead, she gave me a room full of people who showed me exactly who they were. She handed me the evidence I needed, the reason to stop being careful, and the clearest picture I had ever had of who in my life was genuinely for me. She thought the serving dish was a symbol of who held the family together. Turned out she was right about that. She just had the wrong daughter in mind. She set the table to break me. She forgot I was the one who knew where everything was kept,